Thank you, everybody, for hopping into today's webinar. Just to cover some ground rules real quick, attendees can place questions into the Q&A section so that Emily and I can address them. These will be answered either throughout the presentation or at the end. And polls are a feature in Zoom that some presenters may use. If you are needing proof of attendance for today, live and complete attendance is required to receive that, which will be sent directly from me. And then please complete the post-session survey to provide us with some valuable feedback on your thoughts of the session and the overall logistics of the webinar itself. All right. And so today we are going to be covering the impact of social housing on performance and production. Is it longitudinal study?
The one I'm working on my PhD, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yep. So that one. And this is my friend, Emily Lindner. She is a PhD student at the University of Florida, Gainesville. And you're in the animal welfare lab. Is that right?
Yeah, animal behavior welfare. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, then I will hand it over to Emily. And if you want to introduce yourself a little bit and get the ball rolling.
Get my slides up here. And Cora, if you can just tell me you can see it and it's all good.
Yep, we're good.
All right. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. Like Cora said, my name is Emily Lindner, and I'm currently a third-year PhD student in the Department of Animal Sciences here at the University of Florida. And I'm working under the advisement of Dr. Emily Miller-Cushion. And today I'm going to be talking to you about social rearing and how this impacts performance and production in our dairy calves. So to begin this presentation, I want to just start with some background context for you guys. So cattle are a gregarious species that in naturalistic settings, they engage in behaviors between herd members, including things such as allo-grooming, which is social grooming between individuals, social lying, and then feeding behaviors like grazing. And these displays of social interaction have drawn a lot of interest among those that study animal behavior and that are in the field of behavior as a whole. So some of the studies that have looked at naturalistic and semi-naturalistic rearing have found that calves actually start to venture off from their dams and form same-age social groups with other calves. And additionally, these calves begin to display affiliative or positive behaviors between calves, such as frontal pushing or locomotor behaviors at a young age. And with this knowledge that cattle are social in nature, it's interesting to look at the prevalence of housing systems that are present for our dairy calves, especially in the United States. So when we do look at the housing types that are present here in the US, we see that as of 2016, 63% of all calves were housed individually, despite the growing evidence of welfare benefits of social housing. When it comes to factors that are motivating and driving this individual housing of our calves, the biggest concern that is voiced is disease transmission among calves. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the coming slides. Additionally, other concerns that are voiced are unwanted behavioral interactions. So this is things such as cross-sucking in our calves that are grouped or in pairs, because this can lead to things such as naval infections and unwanted injuries. And the last most common voiced concern comes from the labor and management standpoint, since it does take a little more on the labor side to care for calves that are socially reared. However, research has actually shown that there's minimal differences in disease between calves that are housed individually, in pairs, or in small groups. And there is a growing abundance of research showing the benefits of social housing, what it has on calves, especially during the pre and post-weaning periods. So as individuals in the dairy industry, most of us know that consumer perception does drive a lot of what we see and how the dairy industry is evolving as a whole. So it's crucial for us to understand and see how these individuals are taking and interpreting components of calf management. So I just want to highlight this one study here that was conducted at the Minnesota State Fair back in 2020. asking youths and adults what they preferred to see when it came to calf housing. So they were provided this image, but the images were randomized among individuals. And what they found were that youths, which were ages 5 to 17, that about 80% of those respondents preferred the group housed scenario, followed by pair housing and then individual housing. And similarly, when it came to the adults, they followed a similar trend with about 76% of respondents saying group housing, followed by pair housing and individual housing. And the main reasoning behind their choices came to the opportunity for calves to have socialization among other calves, other members of the group, and then as well as space allowance. Aside from just consumer perception, it's really important to see how producers are interpreting these changes and shifts within the industry. So a study coming out of our lab here at UF, we asked specifically about how respondents thought social housing affected calf comfort, which we used as a proxy for trying to get at the calf's subjective experience, this being calf health and their performance. And we can see with the graph on the left that respondents largely thought social housing was good for the calf's comfort, but there was a bit more range where respondents thought it could pose a health risk that you can see with the graph on the right side of the screen. But trying to look at how individuals that were already implementing social housing on farms, we wanted to see how that varied between overall respondents and those that were implementing it. So we can see that respondents that were implementing it perceived it as more favorable for both comfort and health compared to respondents who were not housing their calves socially. And this could be because the decision was already made for the individual, since they've already associated a more positive perception of this practice than those that hadn't implemented it. So in general, I believe that producers are aware and concerned about calf behavior, and they want to understand how it's affected by management to allow for these motivated behaviors and understand how behavior is affected by management and encourage changes to allow for more of these behavioral opportunities in early life for these calves. Oh, this closed caption is here. I'm just going to click that so it's not there. So kind of getting to the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So across the literature, there's been much work looking at the direct impact of social contact, especially during this pre-weaning period. However, there's been less work looking at the longer term effects and the impact early life contact has on development. So with this topic today, I wanted to touch on four main areas that we see social housing having an impact on our calves. There's obviously a lot more, but these are the main four that I will be discussing. And these are going to be health status, and then performance and behavioral outcomes. And then we'll discuss how these early interactions can impact and influence longer term outcomes. So the first of these I'll be discussing it less than the others, as I know Dr. Van Oss will be giving a webinar in 2 weeks, and I know she's going to touch a lot more on the health of socially reared calves. So if you're interested in that after I discuss my points, make sure you guys join her webinar as well. So as I kind of previously mentioned, social housing may have implications for calf health, given that it is a factor that has contributed to widespread use of individual housing and is often voiced as a concern for our producers. And calf health is a key priority for welfare and economics in calf rearing, so it's something to take into consideration. As we've seen across the literature, early life health status can affect and be a predictor of long-term productivity, with studies showing that treatment for BRD, bovine respiratory disease, is associated with reduced long-term weight gain and odds of that heifer remaining in the herd. So additionally, there's evidence in the literature regarding the effects of social housing on calf health is mixed, with some studies showing increased risk of disease and other studies showing no differences or even improved health outcomes for our grouped calves. Similarly, we like to look at individual housing versus pair housing or even small groupings, and we still see that there's minimal differences between these treatments. However, when we look at larger groups, we do see that there is a health risk increase with higher incidences of respiratory illness and diarrhea reported as the group size gets larger. However, social housing does not seem to be the primary health risk here, as there are a multitude of management factors that can influence health status, this being cleanliness and ventilations of the barns, and a big one being like colostrum management, as a few, as there's multitude that can play into health here. But again, I don't want to go fully into this since I know Dr. Van Oss will cover a little more of this. So now I'm going to transition into discussing how social housing impacts our feeding behavior in our calves and how this can influence intake and growth in the short and long term. So as we've discussed, cattle are gregarious in nature, and they experience the effects of social social facilitation and social learning. Social facilitation is the initiation of a particular response when observing others engaged in that behavior, while social learning allows individuals to learn the positive or negative effects of something based on it watching somebody else. So it's pretty common for herd animals to feed together and display effects of social facilitation, particularly when it comes to feeding behaviors as cattle go through many transitions. They start out on milk, transition to starter or grain, and eventually a total mixed ration as they age through the herd. There's been some literature looking at calves that were reared individually or in pairs in the pre-weaning period and found that those individually housed calves consumed less starter during that period, suggesting that social contact promotes the intake of novel feeds. And this increased acceptance of novel feed can be beneficial to calves as it can potentially and does translate to growth benefits in these heifers. So a study that was conducted by my PI during her PhD work, they were looking at the effects of individual versus pair housing in Holstein bull calves and how that social contact affected solid feed intake. And they found that the social contact in early life led to calves consuming more starter or more solid feed, particularly during the weaning period. And this trend was consistent in the literature with other studies finding similar results in calves that were housed socially during the pre and post weaning period. And I've dropped a couple of those under the graph as well. Another important thing to consider when we're looking at the social rearing of our calves is our milk allowance in those calves and how that can impact feed intake in our calves. So this study by Jensen and co-authors, they were looking at the effects of social rearing, so pair housing versus individual housing, as well as offering either enhanced milk or standard milk allowance, where standard milk allowance was 5 liters a day and the enhanced milk allowance was 9 liters a day. And they were looking at the effects of calf performance and their behavior. So they found that calves that were pair housed and provided the enhanced milk allowance, so the 9 liters a day, had greater concentrate intake than calves that were individually housed, but were provided that enhanced milk allowance as well. And I've highlighted the pair housed outcomes on the screen in yellow. And this providing social contact and enhanced milk allowance did translate into growth benefits in those calves that were reared socially and received additional milk. They did have greater body weight gain per day compared to those calves that were housed individually. So many of the feeds that calves are exposed to do have a novel disposition to them, a sense of unfamiliarity, especially the first, potentially second time they're exposed to them. So a study by Whalen and co-authors looked at the effects of housing type on response to a novel feed. which in this study was a total mixed ration that calves hadn't yet been exposed to. And they found that the pair house calves consumed 2.6 times more of this novel feed in the neophobia test compared to those calves that were housed individually. And as well as consuming more of this novel feed during the neophobia test, the pair house calves in the study actually ate more starter than the individually housed calves did as well. And this increased acceptance of novel feeds may have implications for longer term performance, considering heifers are often exposed to novel diets as they develop, like I previously mentioned. And this could potentially improve success and longevity of these heifers once they do reach the lactating herd. So preference for social contact, as we've seen in some of the studies, our pair house calves do have a stronger drive to be around other individuals. So comfort in social feeding scenarios may also influence that social feeding behavior and long-term effects on calf performance. So when it comes to the preference for feeding with other calves or alone, Miller, Cushion, and DeVries found that calves that were housed socially during the pre-weaning period, when given the option to feed alongside another calf, would choose to feed with them versus feeding alone. So the preference for feeding next to their pen mate persisted regardless of the number of buckets provided. As you can see on the graph here, calves that were provided 1 or 2 buckets, they preferred to feed on the social side. So this again does suggest that calves were preferred to feed socially, potentially regardless of competition. So based on the study that was just on the previous slide, we do see some carryover effects of this social contact in early life. So the graph on the left is from the same study that was just on the previous slide. And we do see that post-weaning feed intake meals, the number per day, was higher in those calves that were pair housed in the pre-weaning period compared to those calves that were individually housed. For the graph on the right, these calves were housed in pairs, but were provided either only a single teat and bucket versus 2 teats and 2 buckets to assess competition in these calves. And they found post-weaning that calves were able to adapt to moderate levels of competition by increasing their milk frequency compared to less. So we see that housing type does impact feed intake, growth, and behavioral outcomes in our calves with higher adaptability in competitive situations, as calves are motivated to feed with others regardless of resources. The potential success we see in socially reared calves during the pre-weaning and post-weaning periods may mediate some of the differences we see in growth as calves age, and also indicates that social rearing potentially aids in the adaptation and transition to social grouping. So transitioning to kind of this third point, the impact of social rearing on social development is a topic that has a breadth of research behind it, especially during the pre-weaning and post-weaning periods. But there also is growing research looking at the longer term effects social rearing has on the social development of our dairy calves, dairy heifers, and dairy cows. So we know that physical contact between calves is important. And it has been well established that social contact improves calf welfare. Effects of social housing on dairy calves have been the focus of a lot of research over the last few decades. And we now understand the importance of social contact for behavioral development. And there is a lot of agreement that in the absence of maternal contact, dairy calves should have at least one individual with them. These findings mirror what we know in other species, including humans, where early social contact is crucial for behavioral development, and the consequences of social isolation can lead to the development of abnormal behaviors, long-term differences in the ability to cope with stressors, and neurological changes in cognitive impairments. And when it comes to our calves, this can be very, very well studied in the short-term effects, with studies showing calves just beyond the weaning period and showing broad benefits of social contact, including things such as reduced fear and reactivity to novelty. We also have evidence that social contact is important for the calf's perspective. Calves will work to access another calf to test motivation, and when observed in the pen, they'll spend more time near familiar companions, indicating social bonding between these calves, as we also see too when they do prefer to feed socially. So allowing for social contact and development of social behaviors doesn't only affect development of social preferences, but also could have long-term effects on other aspects of calf behavior, including the ability to navigate social regrouping, which tends to occur quite often as cattle age. And oftentimes, even when calves are housed socially, excuse me, they may be isolated for a period of days or weeks after birth to control for hygiene and allow for individual monitoring, as again, individual housing has been used to watch for health outcomes in our calves, especially in the earlier days. And if they're going to be moved into a larger group, the assessment of health is an important indicator here. But we know that social contact from birth is important in other species as well. So some of my master's work was looking at the effects of early life social contact on adaptation to group setting. So in this study, we manipulated the degree of social contact prior to the movement to a group pen, with calves either housed individually or in pairs for the first 2 weeks of life. And after the first 2 weeks of life, calves were mingled between treatments, with the initially grouped calves at 4 calves per pen. And a week later, they were regrouped into larger groups of 8 calves per pen. And we found that during the initial grouping period, the previously pair-housed calves spent more time lying socially within one body length of another calf compared to calves that were housed individually during the first 2 weeks of life. And when it came to the regrouping event, we did see that those previously pair-housed calves tended to remain in social lying more than those previously individually housed calves. Kind of continuing on this bandwagon, another study I did during my master's was looking at the effects of social housing on social preference when tested in a novel environment. And pair-housed calves in the study were tested with their pen mate and an adjacent neighbor that they had visual contact with. So the individually housed calves then were tested with the calf that they had adjacent to them with that visual contact, and the other calf was from somewhere else in the barn that they did not have any sort of visual contact with. And what we saw here were calves that were raised in pairs spent more time near either one of the calves in the test arena. This also shows us that social housed calves are generally more willing to approach other calves in the novel environment. And when we saw that the previously pair-housed calves were spending more time in close proximity with either of the test calves, we wanted to see that if they had a greater preference for one over the other. So we did see that the previously pair-housed calves did have a greater preference for the more familiar calves, so their pen mate. compared to the calf that was reared next to them, where they only had that visual contact. Where when it came to our individually housed calves, they showed no preference for the calf that was reared next to them, compared to a calf that was from elsewhere in the barn. So this does suggest that calves develop preferences for calves that are reared in the same pen and housed than calves that are housed with visual contact. So rearing calves with only visual contact is not sufficient enough to form meaningful bonds between calves. And so with the same group of animals in this study, another study coming out of my lab from the work from one of our master's students. So once these animals then were weaned and grouped out on pasture, we collected behavioral data through live observation. And what he did here, we were looking at both the individual behavior of the focal heifer and the proximity from other animals in that group. And in general, we saw only slight behavioral differences. For example, the previously socially housed animals were more active, but only at certain times of the day. And we saw no differences with feeding times in these animals. And kind of based off what we saw here with looking at the individual behaviors, we wanted to look at the bigger picture of interactions between those individuals with the proximity threshold that we assigned for them. So looking at these social networks, we related it to the social proximity of heifers on pasture that were either reared individually or in pairs, with the proximity threshold being within 3 body lengths over the course of 30 hours of observation out on pasture. So to orient you with the social network on the screen, the circles represent the individual heifers. So each letter is a different heifer here, with the previously pair housed shown in blue and the individually housed shown in red. And the lines between heifers are scaled to show the duration of proximity. And the structure of the social network suggests that the previous pen mates spent more time in proximity than other pairs of calves. And associations between previous pen mates are shown in those blue lines. So that would be the second graph here. So this does provide some evidence of social bonding between former pen mates, but given the lack of differences in other behavior between previously individually and socially housed calves, it also suggests to us that the present social context may be more influential. And we can't forget to talk about some studies that have looked at the effects of maternal contact on the longer term effects of the calf itself. So there has been some research done looking at the longer term behavioral effects on the offspring. And these results have kind of shown similar results to what we have seen in present studies with looking at the effects of calf on calf rearing. And they found that calves that were provided a form of maternal contact did display more affiliative behaviors, so more of those positive behaviors, the sniffing and mounting behaviors that you see common in calves. When it comes to entering the lactating herd, heifers that did experience maternal contact for the first 12 weeks of life displayed more submissive postures, which suggests that they may be able to integrate into the herd easier than those that maybe weren't provided the maternal contact. And the last study I wanted to highlight with this was looking at the effects of maternal contact on the offspring's interaction with her calf. And we do see that those cows that were mothered spent more time licking their calves in the second lactation and engaged this licking behavior sooner and spent more time with their calves overall. So this could suggest some behavioral carryover effects of this maternal contact in their own life with their dam and how they interact with their offspring. And excuse me. And the last topic I kind of want to cover with the impacts of social rearing is the effects of social rearing on responses to novelty, fear behaviors, and cognition in our calves. So throughout the literature, it's been shown that social housing leads to a number of performance and behavioral development advantages. With calves that were provided social contact, they had reduced avoidance to novel objects during novel object test. They had increased acceptance of novel feeds, like we've seen earlier in the presentation with things such as starter and TMR. They had greater behavioral flexibility during reversal learning tasks. So this is teaching the calf where an object or an item is, and then switching the location and seeing how long it takes for that calf to relearn how to find the object or whatever is being tested. And they also have increased solid feed intake and improved weight gain that, again, we've seen earlier in the presentation. And all these do suggest that providing dairy calves with social contact aids in the ability to cope with stressors and adapt to changing environments. And even in the short term, social contact can have carryover effects on response to novelty, which may explain longer term differences in the ability to cope with management changes. So in a trial that was also conducted in our lab, we looked at how calves responded to novel situations, and we looked at this after the calves were grouped from 2 weeks of age, or for 2 weeks, excuse me. And we were looking at the carryover effects of previous housing treatments during that first 2 weeks of life. So very similar. It's the same study that I had mentioned earlier, just looking at a different thing here. So we were looking at the response to a novel environment and then a novel object, where calves were removed one at a time from their pen and put in the test arena with a ball that you can see in the image. And we analyzed behavioral responses during this test using a principal component analysis. And the results shown here are from the first factor, where higher values describe calves that had more contact with the novel object and lower latencies to contact it. And we can see that calves that were previously housed in pairs for the first 2 weeks of life were more exploratory or less avoidant of the novel object compared to calves that were individually housed prior to grouping. And these findings are consistent with other work showing the effects of social housing for the entire pre-weaning period on response to novelty. But here we see similar effects even when only varying social contact for the first weeks of life, and that persist after the adaptation to the group pens. So generally, we would want cattle to be less reactive to novelty so they can adapt to new housing or management more easily. And so these findings and others do support the importance of social experience for that ability. There it is. It's like frozen for a second. And kind of looking at big picture, because everything here, starting small, has a larger outcome. So given the multitude of challenges experienced by the dairy heifer before she even enters the lactating herd, including changes in housing and management, veterinary breeding protocols, and eventually exposure to the milking parlor, her behavioral ability to adapt to novel environments may be a strong predictor of overall welfare. Since we are aware that these transitions can be disruptive, we have seen things such as reduced rest and more agonistic social interactions between heifers. And although current research is limited in understanding how these early life social interactions can influence longer term performance and production, there is evidence that there is benefits in the pre and post weaning calves, and these can persist as the heifer ages. And kind of bringing up this Wagner study again, social behavior at the time of heifers integrating into the milking herd at 2 years of age was affected by the level of maternal care that these calves did receive. So kind of transitioning into kind of what I'm currently doing, looking at the long-term effects of early life social contact and early rearing. As Cora mentioned at the beginning, this is a longitudinal experiment where we follow these calves from birth until post-calving and getting milk data for the first lactation. So this is a very lengthy study here. And when we enrolled calves, they were housed in 3 housing treatments. We had individually, pair housed, and group housed, and they remained in these treatments from birth until 9 weeks of age. They were then mingled between treatments and put out on pasture and managed based on the management of the research unit there. But then beginning at 6 months of age, we started measuring growth performance and onset to puberty. So we were looking at differences in body weight and hip height, as well as displays of estrus and onset to estrus. And longer term, we are looking at the effects of this early life rearing on maternal behaviors around calving, health status, as well as milk yield during their first lactation. So this is a little graph that kind of summarizes everything that this study that myself and other of my lab mates are doing here. And the ones that are bolded are kind of my current PhD work, and I'll be touching on in the next slide kind of what we've seen so far and some of the prelim and areas that are still ongoing. So we began weekly observations in this study at 6 months of age, looking at these growth outcomes and puberty, onsets to puberty, estrus behavior, and that nature. So heifers were weighed and measured weekly, and we observed first standing estrus with the help of the Estrotech breeding strips, and then we ultrasound for corpus luteums to confirm the onset of cyclicity in these animals. We also collected a blood sample weekly to analyze progesterone levels in our heifers. So in the final data set, we did see greater hip height in heifers that were reared in pairs, but interestingly, not the heifers that were reared in groups, with our previously individually housed heifers being kind of that intermediate group. And we did see a difference between body weight during the time period, and we also saw no effects of social housing on the age of estrus or the age of the first estrus behavior. And however, we have seen in our older age cows, where data collection is still ongoing, that calves that were raised in pairs were heavier at calving. And again, we're still waiting for the rest of the girls to calve out, but I'm excited to see how that lands. And kind of to end on one strong kind of note here, there is evidence of no long-term detriment on social housing, but there is potential advantages which may depend on the nature of social housing. We have seen that social housing has many benefits to the calves in the pre-weaning, post-weaning, and potentially long-term that can lead to a long, successful, hopefully large producing cow, which is what we're here for. In a sense, we want happy, healthy calves, and social housing does provide our calves with the behavioral and social needs to be successful calves and eventually cows. So I know that was a little fast, but thank you all for joining my webinar tonight. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So yeah.
Perfect. I did have one question just to clarify. So you talk about body weight. Did you take any, did you do any body condition scoring alongside the body weight?
We didn't. You're talking for this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we did not. We just took body weight measurements and hip height.
Okay.
Um, yeah, body condition score I would have loved to do. That was a thought after the fact. But you live and you learn when it comes to research. So
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Real quick for me, your video is a little choppy. If you want to just turn it off and then on again, maybe it'll reset itself. I don't know if that's for anybody else, but I think, yep, we're good. Yeah.
it stopped me at some point, Cora. I would have
No, yeah, you were on a
stopped me
roll.
mid-sentence. It was too fast of a roll.
Could have been that break that you needed. There were a couple questions that were thrown into the Q&A. So one question was, expand on or need more explanation on the concentrates in case of the 9 pounds. I think that was pretty, I
That
remember
would
you talking
be
about 9 liters, but yeah.
Yeah. That's a study from Jensen. I don't know the specifics when it came to if they're asking like the concentration of what the milk was. I don't exactly know if that,
Oh, like fat percentage and
yeah,
stuff.
if that's what
Okay.
they're asking. I don't know
Okay.
that off the top of my head.
Okay. Could you go back to that slide and then I'll type in the reference.
Yeah. Yes.
Beautiful.
Apologies that I don't know that off the top of
No,
my.
that's fine. Um
Also, me watching my video now, I do see that it is laggy, so I do apologize.
no, that's okay. That is the nature of Zoom. Right.
The one time I need it to work properly, it doesn't.
And then there was another question where the social interaction time diagram, that was your I want to call it a matrix almost. That's what
Oh,
it looked like. So yeah, just
that's,
kind of go into more detail of explaining that itself.
yeah. Yeah. So this, I will try my best, was work out of the master's and the postdoc in our lab. But so, like I mentioned, the red circles are the previously individually housed calves that, again, were in those treatments from birth until 9 weeks of age. And this study was, I think I had in the last side, I don't have it listed here. Oh yes, I do. It's right here. Was 10 weeks after they were mingled between the previous treatments. So they'd been out on pasture for a period of time before this study had started. So again, previously individuals are in red, previously pair housed are in blue. The thickness of the line, gosh, watching my video now, it's so bad. I'm so sorry.
If you want to turn it off, that's fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
help here so you guys can get my audio. The thickness of the line indicates like more proximity. So again, that proximity threshold was within 3 body lengths. So the thicker the line, the more times those calves were in within 3 body lengths away from each other.
Okay.
So that's why if you look at not the one with the letters on it, but the one on the right, we've kind of just highlighted those pair house ones that tended to have those thicker lines compared to the individually housed ones.
Right, right.
So,
That's a really cool diagram to
yeah,
use for that.
yeah, no,
Very
it's some cool stuff. So it's Impress. It just came out. So if you're interested, would suggest reading it.
It's probably some great stuff in there.
No, it's good.
Awesome. Does anyone else have further questions for Emily?
One for 10 seconds, maybe it'll be better.
Yep, okay, there is another question coming in.
Like I'll trust you to read them, Cora, because knowing my luck.
I got you. Um, I also wonder too, I don't know if this is something that you've done or worked on, but looking at play behavior between individually paired and socially grouped calves. Are you familiar with any of that literature or done any work on that?
I personally haven't done any of the, like, we've looked at locomotor behaviors and things like that, but we haven't specifically looked at play interactions. A lot of the studies we do are more of the effects of the adaptability to
Okay.
novelty in groups. I do know that Margit Jensen's lab has done some work looking at play behavior.
Okay.
She actually does quite a lot, I think. So she is my go-to when it comes. And I believe De Palavera, I apologize if I say that wrong, has done some play
Okay.
behavior as well. And
Do you know
looking at
where they're out of?
Jensen is Denmark, I believe.
Okay.
And I'm not quite sure where De Palavera is now.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. So the question that came in is suckling behavior compensated by mineral inclusions. I'm not sure if that's if the nutrition side, I don't think that's your background, but
So
okay.
unfortunately do not know much of the nutrition side here.
Yeah. But have you with I mean with any of the studies, because I especially with the studies with enhanced intake, have you come across anything that talks about looking into suckling behavior and cross suckling?
We actually there I don't know if it's out yet, but kind of in the same realm, the old master student in my lab was looking at like non-nutritive oral behaviors in
Yeah.
individual versus pair. Even though milk allowance was the same in those calves, we feed 8 liters a day. And we did, I believe her results did find that individually housed calves did perform some more of that non-nutritive oral and sucking on the pen. When it came to our pair house calves, they still, of course, I say of course, engaged in some cross-sucking behaviors you would see on the ears, on the muzzle, and sometimes directed towards the navel area.
Mhm.
Some pairs more than others, some never engaged in it. So don't know if it's kind of like a genetic thing, a learned thing. If one starts it, the other learns it.
Right.
Again, that's them in nature, but
Yeah. I from oh, the word is escaping me right now, but from personal experience, what I've seen and what others have commented on, increased or heightened events of suckling behavior has definitely been associated with either limited or too little of feed and calorie intake. So whether that's your milk, whether that's your starter grain or any grain, any forage that you're feeding with them, if you're also feeding hay at this time. So any limited feed intake, you are more likely to see that suckling behavior. So it you could say and that mineral inclusion piece, but I would say it's more so if you're looking at a feed side, it would be that limited intake over individual minerals. But it's also always a good thing to double check the mineral content of whatever you're feeding to make sure it aligns with the nutrient needs of the calf. So perfect. We'll do one last call for any more questions. I didn't see anything come in. So Emily, I am going to take over real quick. And let's go
yeah, stop
that up.
share thing just over.
Think
Oh, yeah, you're good.
okay. Let's see if that does that go? Is it full screen?
You can see it at least.
Okay, perfect. That's the hard thing because you never
Yeah.
know.
You only got me to be like, yeah, it looks good.
Right. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all so very much for joining us today. Thank you for your great questions. We really appreciate the interaction because that helps lead conversation, but also make sure that we answer any questions that y'all have. regarding this topic and anything that comes along with it, especially since we have the expert here who's doing the work, who's done the work. This is her bread and butter.
I don't know
and
about expert yet, but thank you.
you're doing a PhD, so definitely part of that. So, I am going to throw a few links into the chat. So, if you want to copy and paste those, that would be great. And also, if you have the ability to scan this QR code here, that is the post-session survey. So anybody who is watching, we would really appreciate if you could fill that out. Let us know what you thought of the session itself, and also what you've learned, what takeaways you have from the session, and also if there's anything that we can do to better facilitate this session, and also other topics you'd like to hear in the future. I am very much planning on continuing this program. It's very much a passion project of mine. I love heifer education and anything revolving around heifer raising, and anything we can do to make our heifers better so that they become wonderful cows for us that do everything that we need to do. And so what you put into these animals, you want to get out of them. So, Emily, do you have any final words for the folks?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I appreciate you all joining tonight, supporting, the dairy industry is a passion of mine as well. So I'm happy to, if you guys have any questions that you think of after this presentation, I'm happy to answer them. But yeah, again, I just thank you for joining. I hope we learned something here. It's a huge thing here, but we're all here to make the dairy industry a better industry for the long term.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much and have a great rest of your evening.